Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to talk both about Solana, but then also your broader vision for crypto, which I know you have some thoughts on. Maybe the best place to start is what was the initial vision that you had when you first started working on Solana in 2018, and how much of that do you feel like has become a reality in 2025?
Yeah, I think what's been kind of curious to me, or like pretty interesting, is that the vision really didn't change that much. We started building a blockchain optimized for speed, for performance, and the goal was to make it cheaper and faster. Just kind of like what Bezos has always said. What's going to be a constant 10 years from now is customers are going to want cheaper, faster deliveries or prices and stuff like that. And the use case that I thought was kind of the most obvious one is trading, building markets, permissionless markets. Anyone, anywhere in the world should be able to create a market that's fair and transparent, and users should be able to verify those properties, that you can look at how those markets are structured and know that you're getting the best possible price. And to do that, but also do it as cheaply and as fast as physics allows. And we called it blockchain and NASDAQ speed. And surprisingly, that's basically what it does. It just runs a whole bunch of markets. I think the biggest surprise to us was that how slow the traditional finance adopting this technology is taking and is going to take, but how fast kind of all the tail end crypto stuff took off, like NFTs, meme coins, all of this stuff that just seems like the tip of the noise, like of the internet. That was adopted like almost right away. But the goal has always been, how do we get internet capital markets and real assets on chain with real value, and getting founders liquidity much earlier, getting founders the ability to raise globally, and having users that participate in those have fair and transparent access.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to talk about both the financial side, the fun NFT side, but speaking of that kind of initial vision, now you've talked before about the fact that you kind of came up with all of this after you had 2 coffees and a beer, and you're just like super buzzed. I'm curious, have you ever done that again to try to recapture that magic?
Yeah, I've definitely had coffee and beer in a combination since then, and it hasn't materialized in anything interesting. So that was kind of a unique experience.
Okay, so not necessarily something you're advising the founders in the audience.
It could work for you, I don't know.
Yeah, just try it enough times and it'll happen.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you were surprised that on the financial side, the adoption hasn't happened as quickly. Why do you think that is?
A lot of finance is kind of built around these laws that were developed end of 2 centuries ago, like end of 19th century and 20th century. And basically you had like the railroad boom, and your neighbor would say, I have this certificate to a company that's claiming they're building railroads somewhere in the West. Do you want to buy it from me? Well, you had no idea if that company existed, if that railroad was ever built, if you're getting like a forged or real certificate even. So a lot of scams happen. And because of that, regulators came up with a whole bunch of laws and structures, and eventually culminated in the Securities Act. And all these, if you think of this as software and APIs, all of these APIs were built before the internet. So we have this very robust financial system, but it's built around humans and paper and faxes and like very, very slow process. And it's why you have like 2-day settlement times and all of these kind of processes that take a really long time. And unfortunately, these are just kind of slow systems that don't work with the internet. Crypto solved a whole bunch of problems that would have been not possible, and all that certificate forging and all these things just are not possible with crypto. And you can think of it kind of like the e-commerce moment in the 90s. When you submit your credit card today, you have this lock on your screen in your browser. It cryptographically guarantees that your credit card is not going to be stolen during that transaction. You can now sign, and away you go. That's effectively digital money being passed through the internet. Well, if I transfer a token to you, you have a full cryptographic chain of custody between me and the issuer, like the company that actually created that token. And you can go look at their public key and see that they signed an S1 filing to the SEC and yada, 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 and have full guarantees that you're actually getting what I'm claiming you're getting. So all of the stuff that's being done by humans and faxes is effectively done with math and public blockchains. So the biggest challenge here is that the people and the regulators that have built these systems that work don't want to change, and that's going to just take some time.
Right. So you're talking about all these ways that crypto doesn't have those sort of risks that sort of traditional finance did. At the same time, obviously there have been some pretty high profile crashes, rug pulls, things like that. So I guess maybe can you talk a little bit more about maybe there's fewer risks on some areas, but clearly there are still some pretty significant risks.
Yeah, of course. So markets absorb information, and if that information is unknown, when it exposed, markets move really fast to correct. So the goal is you can solve all the technology problems. I can tell you that you're getting a certificate, but I have no idea that the company is doing X or Y, right? Like these are the things that are opaque about finance. And the more that you can push on chain, the fewer failures you're going to have. So for example, during like a flash crash that was like 2 weeks ago, you have protocols like Camino that are formally verified that keep a real-time tracker of all the assets on chain, and they can liquidate in real times. And you as an investor or participant in that market, you know exactly what the risks are. And that market is absorbing information basically at 400 millisecond rate. And if that was a brick and mortar store, you would have no idea what is their actual collateral, what is their debt, and an auditor could make a mistake. Even if people are not being malicious, you still have mistakes that propagate in those brick and mortar systems that end up with, oh man, these guys just said that they had XYZ collateral, but that doesn't really exist. And then you have a very sudden, very fast change in markets that causes these effects.
Right. And you talked about the regulatory side, and I think you've spoken about sort of being happy with some of the recent changes. How close are we to kind of the regulatory landscape that we'd like to see? Are there other changes you'd like to see made?
Yeah, I think on the kind of the biggest changes already happened. So I think the Genius Act is passed and signed, and if crypto is at 250 billion in stablecoins prior to the Genius Act really coming online. And people are estimating somewhere between 1 trillion to 10 trillion digital dollars being minted in the next 5 years, which is like an insane number. I honestly can't comprehend what that means, but if there's really going to be trillions of dollars, digital dollars, on public chains, it means finance has been completely restructured around this whole new concept of settlement and real-time guarantees through public ledgers.
Right.
So I think it'll definitely transform fintechs and payments, and we see folks like Stripe acquiring companies in crypto now and really being at the forefront of developing those technologies and integrating them into traditional finance.
And so if those changes, start to happen or continue to happen, particularly for people, entrepreneurs in the audience who, maybe are trying to raise some funding today, hopefully maybe 5 or 10 years from now have a company that they're thinking about taking public, how do you think crypto could change the process for them?
I think a lot of stuff is actually, the problems that founders need to solve are all going to stay the same. You still need to find product market fit, which means you need to find a pain point that customers have and create value there and charge them for it and find profit and scale it up. So those problems are still just as hard. I think the advantages that you have now is that things that are expensive, like cross-border, back-end, back-office settlement, if you use stablecoins and crypto for that, you can effectively cut your costs much, much faster and much cheaper than before. But I don't know if anyone here has worked on payments. It is a slog. It's very, very hard to build a payments network because you need merchants and customers and everybody to be online at the same time effectively with liquidity and being able to accept and send money. It's a very, very hard problem. But I think this is almost like one of the big changes, I landed in the United States from the Soviet Union basically in 1992 as a kid. Went from, no technology to internet. And that was such a huge change in what you can do with tech. that it felt like a huge break from traditional communications to the internet. It was just a massive change. And my young brain was very adaptive, and I kind of absorbed it immediately. And my parents got me a computer. I was on IRC chats and news groups within 6 months. But it takes a very long time for people to understand these big changes, like the idea of public keys and private keys and a seed phrase and real-time settlement. All this stuff just doesn't, people don't get it yet. So I think this is going to be part of the slowest part of growth is it took people 10 years to understand what a web link was, for the internet to actually build Friendster, and then for Facebook to come out of all of that. I think you're still going to see this 10-year process, people understanding ledgers and settlement and cryptography, and then you're going to see these massive companies being built on top of this technology, just like you saw with Facebook, that are true from the ground up, entire financial systems that are completely native to crypto.
Yeah, I was watching an interview you gave at another tech conference that shall not be named, and you were talking about this idea that, basically our brains need to catch up to crypto in the same way that we had to catch up to the internet. And as I was listening to that, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And then as time passed, I was like, wait a second though, but a web link is it's a new idea, but it's not that, at least once it's consumer friendly and I can type it into a browser, it's not that complicated versus all the different parts of crypto. I think that there's a significantly higher barrier, isn't it?
I think people kind of do at a gut level understand what a secret is and a password. There's some of that, but understanding I think the implication that this is a mathematical certainty and nobody can change this immutable record. I think that takes time for people to kind of fully get. But we have some precedent of that. You go to you sign, you purchase real estate, your county office records this in this ledger, and you kind of get this idea, oh man, that's the source of truth for who owns what house.
Right. And do you think that, so it sounds like you think that that's really it's a concept that people just have to get, as opposed to it's not so much a threshold in terms of the product just has to make that complexity more invisible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually happening faster outside of the US because there's so much less trust with local ledgers. What that means is governance is bad in a lot of places outside of the US. So people don't trust their government. They don't trust their government to track their wealth correctly or not seize it randomly. So they trust Bitcoin more because of this, because they know that the government can't mess with it. So when you take people out of the equation and you're left with just math and data, you kind of can trust that more if you've had experiences that are negative with people, which I think a lot of immigrants probably in the US can talk about. But I think most folks living in the US just haven't experienced those kind of systemic failures.
Right. Is there also sort of, you're talking about this sort of just understanding that, on this kind of fundamental technical level, there's certain things that can happen. But is there also just sort of a PR problem, essentially, to get people on board with it after things like FTX, that maybe you could sort of argue technically people are protected, but they're just going to be this seems really bad and I don't want to have anything to do with it?
So again, I think if you are a back office finance person, you actually get crypto much, much faster. I think similarly, the internet first really became used in back-end businesses with email, and then people started sending links to Dancing Baby to each other, and now I'm oh yeah, I kind of get it. So finance people deal with settlement risk all the time. They deal with banking risk all the time. So right after FTX, SVB, and a whole bunch of banks had a crisis, right? And if the government didn't bail out, a lot of companies that were funded in Silicon Valley would have been screwed. Their runway was stuck on Silicon Valley Bank, and the money wasn't there. So that risk. Every CFO at every company that's been funded understands that's their whole job, is to avoid that risk. So once the back-end office starts using crypto and starts using public ledgers, by that I mean just stablecoins, just dollars issued on a public ledger, they understand the settlement guarantees that they get with their private keys. And then that means that those folks understand it deeply, and you kind of start seeing this proliferation to consumers and retail But that's going to come later because most of the time retail is just not exposed to those risks. The government bails it out when it gets big enough and stuff like that.
Yeah. You also mentioned that the flip side of the financial world adopting this kind of slower is that you've been surprised to see kind of like how quickly people embraced NFTs, meme coins, and things like that. Solana, among other things, the Trump coin was minted on Solana. As I understand it, that's not really something you have any control over.
Yeah, I mean, Solana is literally a protocol. So like email is a protocol. There's a whole bunch of standards around email. There's a whole bunch of code and standards around Solana. Anyone could go and run it. And people can create markets for anything. So I can send you an email with a link to Trump coin or fart coin. And that, again, both of those are protocols, the email and the underlying protocol that creates that market. My kind of like eureka moment for this stuff was I used to play Ultima Online, EverQuest. I don't know if folks remember those games. So
all the old folks in the audience?
Yeah, so I would my first experience with programming was to build like a auto farmer in Ultima Online to go mine wood, and then I would sell it in Ultima. And people would send me like a cashier's check over like the snail mail that I could go cash and then spend on whatever I wanted. So I think as soon as you have kind of this collective shared state where people share an experience, even if it's digital, people will create kind of markets for random stuff that is totally seems like superfluous. Like it has no meaning outside of the meaning in that little ecosystem. So the internet is a shared digital state, but for the entire world, not just a tiny little game. So those markets can get really big really quickly. And this is kind of like, I think, the bizarre kind of thing that was really unexpected. But if you look at like mobile gaming revenue for loot boxes and iOS, a public company, that's like 100 billion of payment volume a year, right? So if just a small portion of that ends up in the shared state, crazy numbers can happen.
So when you see something like Trump coin or fart coin, like something that's maybe a little bit easy to either get mad at or laugh at, to you, like you're like, this is like very natural and this is fine.
Yeah, to me, this is like loot boxes, basically.
Yeah.
But like the benefit of that, of those things happening is like for the same reason that iOS is able to take those revenues and build an awesome platform where you can use FaceTime for free. These are all stress tests that force like real value at risk. There's real money at stake. And the engineering has to be incredibly good to be able to serve all these markets at the same time globally around the world, like in real time, with transparency and cryptographic guarantees, and make sure that nobody can like modify the markets to their advantage. And that is awesome, because then you can use this technology for issuing shares. You can be a founder that doesn't pay Goldman Sachs 10% of like their IPO price like Figma did. You can literally just use a smart contract, direct list, get access to global capital, and not have this crazy price difference between the dollars that you get and what retail pays. Like the whole point of this technology, or I think any technology, is that progress moves forward when it can make the world cheaper, faster, and like reduce costs for end users.
And so, talking about, Solana, there's this whole ecosystem that you don't control. So this is kind of a basic question, but talk about just sort of what is obviously you're the CEO of Solana Labs, but sort of what is your role now in your relationship to the protocol?
So Solana Labs builds products. One of the products we recently shipped was Android phone with kind of the slick integration for signing. The goal is to give users like an Apple Pay, hell yeah, Seeker. Go to solanamobile.com and buy a Seeker. So I get to sell phones now. The goal is to build like an Apple Pay-like experience for signing crypto, because a lot of the complexity and understanding security and all of these things can be abstracted away in I think the most important device that has been built in the last like 50 years, which is your smartphone. So that's part of it. The other part of my life, I think, is if I could do whatever I wanted, I'd probably spend all my time coding deep in the code, consensus optimizations, all of this kind of deep protocol work I love to do. So this is something that I have to like peel myself away from. But talking to all the amazing consensus engineers and folks working on the protocol is just something that probably spend all my time on that's free.
But you still spend a little bit of your time actually in the code.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference now is that with AI, you kind of see, I mean, this has been my experience. AI has been like a great force multiplier for, I think, somebody that's an expert. So I had 15 plus years coding by hand, like in VI, optimizing code, staring at debuggers. The crazy thing about AI now is I can kind of like just watch Claude churn through its thing, and I can almost smell when it's going off the rails and correct it. So I can have like the time that if people are in a meeting with me and I'm not paying attention, it's because I'm watching Claude.
I wonder what it would feel like to be able to almost smell when Claude was going wrong. But one of the challenges in preparing for this interview is the fact that I started talking to your team maybe a month ago or whatever, and there just keep being these like new developments in Solana, some of which you have more to do with than others. But I think one that happened yesterday was this like basically these bitwise Solana ETFs went live. Do you want to just tell us a little about that?
Yeah, it's weird. How does a protocol go public? Or like this is where you have this, we have a global permissionless ledger that can create its own markets, has access to liquidity globally, but you still have Wall Street with these like old school human-based APIs. So the crazy thing is like a totally third party, Bitwise and Grayscale, like people that I cannot fire or hire, they can go public for a protocol. So they can go figure out all the data that the SEC needs, all the disclosures, submit an S1, and get ETF for the Solana protocol listed on traditional Wall Street markets. And it's pretty cool because this is, I think, the first staking ETF. So it's not just the token that's listed, it's the whole security model of getting rewards and staking and participating in the network. It's like all of the stuff, all the code that I wrote at like 2 a.m. It's like part of the disclosures on Wall Street, which is really kind of crazy to think about, but a huge step, I think.
Was it slightly terrifying to see your code in like SEC disclosures?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Are there other projects that you're kind of seeing sort of in the works that you just think, wow, this is really cool?
I think like some of the, again, more exciting stuff is pretty boring, and it's getting something like a lending protocol formally verified. I think one of the coolest things that I've seen recently is like Camino has done 2 separate formal verifications. So the challenge with trusting finance with money, software with money, is that software has bugs. Anyone that's ever written software knows that they write bugs. I write bugs. When I tell Claude to write software, it also generates bugs. How can we actually trust these systems with millions of dollars? Like people's lives are ultimately at stake, their careers, payroll, all this stuff is ultimately at risk when you escrow those funds with software. I think the coolest thing has been in, I think, the recent 5 years is formal verification, and with AI being able to generate formal proofs for the software that you're writing. So I think we're going to start seeing incredible improvements in reliability, and that's going to allow us to put more trust, more funds at risk in the software, which ultimately reduces cost to users, reduces risk, and stuff like that. So you kind of think of finance as like logistics. When you have speed bumps, use more gas. When your roads are inefficient, use more gas. When your roads are so poorly constructed, you have crashes. That is like a massive cost to society. Same thing with finance. If you have a person that can make a mistake and that could cost the company $1 billion, that's a very risky process that is better off with formally verified software. So as the software kind of eats the world, finance is probably the last bastion of that because so much is at risk, but I think we're starting to see both cryptography and formal verification kind of make that reality.
So it sounds like part of what you're saying is that in terms of closing that gap between the fun, meme stuff versus the finance stuff, a lot of that is about sort of just building the kind of more boring infrastructure.
Absolutely, yeah. It's building it and proving it out and making sure that all the risks that you can manage with software and cryptography actually are managed correctly.
Well, there's so much more I want to ask you, but unfortunately we're out of time. So Anatoly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.